And welcome. We are live from the basement. Ed Bailey and Nick Hudecker. See, I got it right this time.
You got my name
There
right.
we go.
Good job,
There
man.
we go.
It's only taken about 9 months.
There we go. It is not great weather in Atlanta. How's the weather out in California now?
It's beautiful here. It's like everybody should move to California, frankly. If wildfires and mudslides are your thing and then sunny weather, you should definitely be looking at California.
Hey, never rains in Southern California,
Right.
most of the time.
So we got some interesting stuff to talk about today.
Yes, we do. I'm excited about it. I think we're going to start talking about what kind of skill sets does an observability engineer need. Talk about, first of all, what the hell is observability? I think that's the first question we have. And then what
It's
kind
an
of
open issue, right? I mean,
Yep.
I was just on a podcast earlier this week, and it's exactly what we talked about. Like, what is this thing? How is it evolving? What kind of tools do you need, and so on. So it's a hot topic.
It really is. Let's talk about it's like when I started out doing this 20 years ago, the kind of skill set you needed, and even within the last few years. And now I think people are finally seeing the value of operational security data. How do you unlock this massive data set that's only recently getting attention? But it requires skill set, requires tools, requires data. So I'm going to share a deck and let's get started.
Yeah, we'll put some content together really quick and we'll run through it.
Here we go. So becoming an observability engineer and valuable skill sets to build in 2022. It is 2022. Oh, I still can't get used to that.
I can't believe we're almost done with January in 2022, right? I mean, that's what's blowing me away. Let's take it from the top, right? So what is this observability thing? We've had monitoring for a long time. We're going to talk about the contrast here in a bit. But monitoring presumes that you know what you want to know, right? You know what things you want to get alerted on and so on. But things are a lot more complex now, right? It's not single system. It's one application is comprised of dozens of different services. There could be 10 or more different technologies within each of those services. They might have their own database running just for that one little microservice application. And so and then Ed, you can add in anything here around containers, right? I mean, those things are ephemeral by design. And so by the time you might know what you want to know or you realize there's an issue, you simply cannot set up monitoring for all this stuff, right? And so observability is this idea of, well, I don't always know what things are going to go wrong. I don't always know what kind of questions I want to ask. Give me an opportunity to ask those questions. And this is this kind of like discovery use case. Now that's kind of the industry standard, right? Kind of definition, but there's as many definitions for observability as there are companies in the space. Ed, how does this, you come from like a security background, a logging analytics background. How does this gel with your experience?
Very much so. And let's just go back to even a few years ago, you could start setting static alerts for this and that because you had a fairly limited number of variables. And now, as you mentioned, with containers, ephemeral, serverless, the number of assets, the number of variables that are potentially in play are infinite. It's incredible, and you can no longer rely on static alerts. And you have to turn the perspective and look for what you don't know. Look for deviations from the baseline. Look for deviations of unexpected, because, and also I want to emphasize what we're talking about. Observability applies to operations and security. Mm-hmm. The security use cases for this are infinite because the greatest threats to any security environment are the ones you don't even know about. It's the CVE that's not published. It's the exploit you've never heard of. It's the method. It's the actor. And you have to, how do you detect issues through behavior? And so security, applications, it's all the same. And that's where you need that analytics skill set to understand the baseline, understand deviations to the baseline, and then be able to drill down to what is that deviation. And there's so many interesting ways to look at data. But I think this is where this is important. In order to do this, you have to have a different perspective on data, and you also have to have an analytics background and a technology background. You can't just say, okay, I know statistics, so I can do this. You need to understand the context of what you're looking at.
Yeah, and that's the big issue, right? It is the context, right? And being able to take a new data set, drop it in a new context, or into an existing data set into a new context. Let's keep moving on this. We want to,
but that's just a quick slide, especially about how monitoring falls short, because I mean monitoring is great for what you know, But if you don't know it, you don't know it's there, you don't know how to understand it. It's just the standard. Okay, we're going to have 10,000 alerts that are going to run every minute, and we're going to look for some sort of static string. It's just not going to do it anymore.
And I think the reaction has been, all right, to the reaction to alert fatigue is, I'm going to use AI. I'm going to use some AI ops platform, and that's going to solve a lot of my problems. I don't think people are really getting there, right? I think
No.
they're focused on the algorithms and the models and so on. They're not focused on the things that feed that, right? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in order for machine learning, I hesitate to use artificial intelligence. I think it's just too grandiose a term.
Yes.
But in order to use machine learning, like, you need a ton of data, and
Right.
that data needs to be very high quality. It needs to be labeled. It needs to be conditioned in a certain way.
Right.
And so companies will acquire these AI ops platforms, and they're like, okay, now what? Right. I
Right.
thought the platform was going to do this data work for me, and they just don't.
Yep.
And so even some of those, I think you're seeing fairly basic deployments, today. You're not seeing them kind of be these game changers that they're positioned as, but that's fairly standard, right? New technology comes out. There's a lot of hype around it. It's going to solve all my problems. And then disappointment sets in. AI ops is no different here, I think, but it really is data dependent. Even for the analytics ed you were talking about, right? Like, if you don't have the right data, good luck.
Exactly. Who invented AI ops? Was that a Gartner term? Let me see. Where
I
did that?
have no idea.
Yeah.
It certainly
Yeah.
sounds like one, but you
Yeah.
know, analysts love their ops terms, data ops, you
Yeah.
name it. That's actually one we can't claim though. Somebody else invented that one. Um,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of money being invested in these platforms. A lot of companies are acquiring them, and success is mixed, and it's hard to come by.
Yeah. And this is the thing that, I mean, we work for a tool vendor, but it's beyond the tool. It's the data, the skill sets, how you apply the tool. So many of the apps platforms that I'm familiar with, they promise some sort of golden solution, some sort of black box that will give you all the answers, and it's almost never the case.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
need
So
flexibility. And if this, it's going to be always be an intersection of data, people, and the tool,
yeah.
and companies have to focus on that. Can't just write a check and solve a problem.
But net, right? The difference
Mhm.
between monitoring and observability is this kind of expansive view, right? Like, monitoring was very much built for limited types of deployments, limited types of problems, and that's not how the world works anymore, right? Observability is
Yeah.
very much, it's inclusive, right? Not like a DEI kind of inclusive, but maybe, right? More
Mhm.
diversity of data, including more of that into your analysis, but very much focused on like distributed systems, as we've got listed here. Being able to kind of preserve your options for what you want to do with data later on. You may not know, right, the value of data when you first collect it, but it might that data might become more valuable over time. And
Right.
so in a traditional monitoring scenario, it's very costly to store that stuff. So you're fundamentally limited on your options. And that's really where the observability story starts to gain momentum.
All right. Next slide.
All right.
So let's talk about the observability engineer. I think is well said. Community practice, a hybrid role. You're in the center between the operations, the architecture, the tools. You need a broad skill set. It's not just one thing. I think years ago when we started doing this it was a lot of Unix admins who understood. I know how to stand up a tool. I know what my standard logs are, and I think went really well for some time. But then you started to bring in your application logs, your non-standard data sets, your complex data sets, and that's where you have to expand the skill set to do just what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, the scope of concern kept getting bigger, right? For this
Yes.
role, like these sysadmins. And I don't think that people are walking around like, nobody's got observability engineer on their business card today. Right. But it's kind of this, like, just what it says here. Like, it's a collection of things that a certain group of people do. Right. And we've got them listed here. Right. So there's going to be a
Mhm.
security component to an observability engineer. Right. That may not be 50% of what he or she does, but it's going to be a facet of it in some way.
Right.
Very focused on operations, right? This is, got to keep the trains running on time. And I know it's really popular right now to think like, oh, we're going to have DevSecOps and we're going to shift all of these things left. I'm sorry, it's not happening, right? Like,
Right.
shift left is really stuck in neutral right now,
It's
because developers aren't incentivized to write secure code. They're
right.
not incentivized to make sure that their code runs efficiently in these new environments because that's not their job. Their job is to ship features, period. And many of them may not have the expertise to do those other things anyway. And executives may not, or management may not know what's happening. They're just happy to see new things deployed. And so the observability engineer, that's going to be another element, right? Security operations, doing some kind of analytics, or what Ed was talking about earlier, whether that's tool supported, or you're doing your own kind of almost data science work
Right.
over some of these data sets. And then vendor, this is something that you added to this, and I think it's really interesting, and I want you to dive into it. The
Sure.
vendor management piece, right? Like this is fascinating to me that this observability engineer is going to be managing vendor relationships. So what did that look like when you were in your previous life?
A big part of it was feedback of how do I get new features? How do I exploit the data in order to get value? They're very expensive tools. So for me, it was two part of I need to make sure my company is seeing value. And so I'm going to keep going back and back in terms of how do I get more analytics? How do I get more visualization capabilities? How do I like Splunk Dashboard Studio, for example, was a big piece. We pushed hard because we need better ways to get value out of our data. And I realized early on that there was a treasure trove of things we could do. I mean, we had an earlier live stream talking about operational analytics for the biz ops teams who had no idea what I was talking about when I came to them. Once they understood it, were like, yes, give us more. But I needed that feedback from the I needed that feedback. I needed that help. I needed the vendors to understand, that yes, you cannot charge us this and still keep us as a customer. There has to be an equitable relationship. So there was a lot of back and forth, and it's important to stay engaged with your vendors because I think that you need the capabilities and you need the support in order to advance the art of what you're doing.
I think things now are so complex that like you have to treat your vendors as a partner,
Yes.
right? It can't be a punitive relationship like it has historically been. And the other part of this you've mentioned in the past is, privately is vendor management when it comes to managed service providers, right? Was that like, you're not hitting your SLAs and SLOs? Were you holding their feet to the fire if performance wasn't what you expected?
Yes, and that was part of also our constantly evolving architecture was how do we manage our dependencies on these vendors? And this is something that people always talk about, like for managed service providers, SaaS providers, as an idea that, oh yeah, this is great, we can get value from them quickly, we can onboard them quickly. I wanted to make sure that we could leave them just as quickly. And that was a big part about bringing in things like log streaming in the environment because I started decoupling dependencies, and that was a big part. It made sure the vendors understand that yes, I love you, but we have the ability to do something else very quickly. We don't have that normal stickiness that you have with other customers.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because like you hear a lot of CIOs saying, I want a multi-cloud strategy in case I have to move. I don't want to be locked into this vendor.
Right.
I think you can take that too far, right? Like
Yes.
like you're just you're just not going to flip a switch and change from one cloud to another, even if you
Ooh,
think you've designed for it. You're just not going to test that often enough because there's just too much, right? There's
right.
just way too much to do. But I think in a narrower scope like this, like for observability, for monitoring, for SecOps, you can start to build in those abstractions just in case, right? Even
Right.
if that's just upgrading, right? Like I got a new database version, I want to test it first. Being able to have those abstractions in place even keeps you safe in that type of deployment as well.
And
Um,
even internally, it was very important. And I think this feeds back to observability is that you have to have standards of data. You have to constantly work with your stakeholders, especially the development teams. This is the kind of data we'll accept. We need you to do this. We need you to do that, because you have to lower the barrier of getting value from data. When you have hundreds of different data formats, it gets really hard. But if
yeah.
you get it to 10 or 20, it's amazing how much value you can unlock from all this data.
Ooh, so you're really jumping ahead in our content though, right? We're going to talk about data structure here in a bit.
Oh yeah, we
Um,
will.
but so kind of net, like the idea is this observability engineer is not like a job title.
Yeah.
I see it in some job titles, right? People are looking for an observability engineer. It's not really common yet, but it is kind of a collection of things that people do. And I think you're going to see a community around this. You're going to start to see, like, if you say you do observability, I expect you to be able to do X, Y, Z really well. And then there's going to be a secondary and tertiary set of skills as well as part of this type of role.
One more thing I want to say is increasingly I'm seeing these skill sets as companies make the decisions to break down barriers in data. Instead of having operation teams and security teams doing logging separately or managing data separately, to have an enterprise team that serves the enterprise. And that's increasingly where you see these skill sets start to converge and be able to serve the needs of the enterprise and not just their particular silos or business
And
units. And so,
yeah,
go
it's
ahead.
think because it's the exact opposite in data and analytics,
Mhm.
right? You're seeing new architectures like a data mesh type of story, which is almost like a socio-technical architecture, right? Where there's so much specialization around data in, say, finance versus HR versus some other targeted business unit, that people, I think, are starting to realize that they can't share that context as broadly as they might want, right? Every business unit is going to interpret that data differently. And
Right.
so you're seeing kind of swing the opposite direction for more targeted data and analytics, where, all right, this business unit owns that data. They own the context and they can kind of share that context. Whereas in more kind of this, what we're talking about from observability really impacts the entire enterprise, especially
Right.
from a security perspective. So there's no kind of one size fits all data architecture for all this stuff.
There certainly isn't, and that's where it's important to have that kind of that flexibility to apply concepts and principles to a particular situation and move forward.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
All right,
All
let's
right.
go to the next slide. So let's talk about what does an observability engineer need to know? As you mentioned, data types, structures. It's important to understand this, but also to take it beyond traditional data warehouse backgrounds, database backgrounds, where it's all structured data, it's all very slow moving, it's all very well defined. We're talking about operational data, talking about security data that's constantly in motion, constantly churning, and so you have to find ways to manage the churn, but also shape the data as needed, and that's where good quality data tools are needed in order to do so.
But Ed, there's unstructured data too. And this is my hot button issue. But
Yes, yes. Let's look at some syslog. We'll talk about some
yeah,
unstructured data. How
we'll talk
about
about
that?
structure.
Yeah,
It's always funny
great.
because people are like, when big data was a thing, it was like,
Mhm.
all right, well, I've got structured data, and they kind of treated structured data as like boring, right?
Right,
Because it was understood because there's structure to it, and then
right.
everything else like log data or anything they would like JSON data, people would always just default to, oh, that's unstructured data. That's like a special kind of challenge. Look, there's structure there, right? If
Oh
there's
yeah.
not
Mhm.
structure to it, it's just noise. The structure
Right,
might be now the way that you can think about this is structured data. Let's pretend that these two words have meaning. Structured data has externally defined structure, right? Like you might
right.
have it in a database table. All right, you have your column names, you have your column types, and so on. Um, and then unstructured data is the structure is embedded within the data itself. And for some reason, people really trip up on this, right? But it's all the structure is there. You just have to know how to extract it. And
Right.
so knowing what all these different data types are, maybe how to find that structure, how to interpret it, that's something that an observability engineer definitely needs to know. And like Ed mentioned, right? Syslog, right? There's dozens of different syslog formats out there. You might upgrade your firewalls and all of a sudden you've got a new version of syslog that you
Yeah.
didn't expect, or some new interpretation of it. So you really have to know, you have to have a very good foundation in basic data manipulation and management.
Yeah, and that's where the standards come in. I mean, we had something. We had a new set of firewalls, and guess what? Timestamp change threw off everything,
Yeah.
and there was unfortunate words were uttered very loudly. So,
Well, and
you know,
so people are talking about open telemetry, like it's going to be this new standard, it's going to fix all of these issues. You're going to have the same issues, right? You're going to have the exact same problems. Everyone's going to interpret the standard differently. Every vendor is going to want to kind of maintain the status quo of, we want to keep our data in its own format, so it's not easily shared, et cetera. But I don't think open telemetry is going to be a silver bullet here either.
Right, you need universal adoption, and that's just not gonna happen. I mean,
No.
I wish it would. I mean, you look at, like, syslog considered universal adoption, but when you really look at it, there's a couple of defined, very well-defined syslog RFCs that maybe 50% pay attention to.
Yeah.
And so that's the issue, and that's why you have to start with standards and across your enterprise. It's a big part. It's boring. It's painful. It's emotionally just draining having to deal with people begging them to, yes, I need the host name in the event. I need a timestamp. I even need like the time zone. But it's everything starts with good data, and the standards are what drives it.
Yeah. So you've got to know that. I think the other piece that is essential is time series analysis,
Yes.
right? This is a fairly specialized form of analysis, but we see this a lot in metrics databases, time series. There are dedicated time series databases, and they typically have functions around like windowing and range types of queries, and they do special types of grouping and compression around uh, sensor names or any other kind of indexes that you might create. So you can do a lot of time series analysis in a traditional database, but this is fairly specialized, and there are dedicated database like InfluxDB is one. Ed, I know there's a million of them out there, though.
Yeah. I mean,
OpenTSDB is another.
right. I mean, Splunk's a time series database. I mean, those
Yeah,
are all,
yeah, that's a good
and
point.
and just it's very important to be able to understand, like a very common thing I would see people do is, so I'm laying out data on a range and I'm looking at the average, but then they don't quite understand about how the average affects the result, of how you can create your average can sample out the spikes that you're looking for. And that's where, and then we'll talk about that, but that context of how you're applying your statistical analysis to your data really matters. But you have to be familiar with the various options in order to train your users to get the best results.
Yeah. And there's some great courses on Coursera and Udacity if you want to start to develop a foundation in time series analysis. I've taken a few of them, they're pretty good.
They are.
They go into various levels of depth. There's the free courses, which are kind of more of an overview or a survey. And then there's the paid ones that are much more in depth into different types of analysis and what that means. And it's kind of fun to play with it, right? Because you can play with weather data. That's a time series. You can play with stock data. That's another time series. And so there's a lot of applications for that type of analysis.
Very
Um,
much so.
and then, this kind of surprised me when I joined Cribl, right? Because I come from a traditional data management background. And that search and regular expressions is really the lingua franca of
Yes.
observability, right? It's SQL has some benefit, right? We got that in the next bullet, but it really is this, I have to know how search systems work. I've got to know like how things get indexed and so on. And then regular expressions, because that data is first, it's so vast and so variable.
Right, and that's where regular expressions. I mean, I am not good at regular expressions, and but it's a requirement, because that's a lot of times if you don't have, as you said, well structured or operational data, you use the regex in order to. That's how you create your field. That's how you define your structure.
Yeah.
And so it's just that's your best option. It's your most efficient way to process a lot of data.
And I used to be pretty good at regular expressions a long time ago, but now I'm not, right? It's one of those things, like it is a fragile skill set. Like you've got to keep working on it. It's not like
Oh yeah,
jumping back on a bicycle after 10 years, right?
yeah. Regex
You're
101 is your buddy.
yeah, exactly. What was the book? Mastering Regular Expressions, right? That thing was next to me at my desk all the time.
Yes.
Um, and then, look, the reality is that based on the diversity of things that an Ollie engineer is going to be doing, you're going to have more depth in other systems, right? You're going to need to know some SQL, not like super in depth. You're not going to be writing, user defined functions or anything like that, but being able to browse a database and connect to it and understand kind of the underlying, principles of
Right.
a data store, and frankly, every database today, if you're taking it seriously, it's going to have some kind of SQL or queryable front end, even if it's a NoSQL database. Things like Couchbase, right? Like they've got their own SQL dialect. Cassandra has its own. And so that's going to be more and more available. If you want to get into more in-depth data analysis, pretty much Python, I think, is where most of that momentum is. And then, from a just linking,
Python's data science toolkit is invaluable. It's
it
very,
is,
very good.
truly. And I think that is pretty much the standard anymore, right? We saw a lot of variability initially with R and things like that, but I think it's just so approachable.
Yes,
Such an easy to use
exactly.
language. Yeah. And then shell scripting, because you're always linking things together. I think this is, even today, like I work in marketing, right? I don't write code very much anymore. But shell scripting is something I use almost daily to make things, just to connect things.
Mm.
You remember when it used to be Perl, right? We'd all write Perl, like the write only language for doing a lot of these things. But now it's Python and shell.
Right.
And pick your poison, right? Whether it's Bash, ZSH, whatever. Ed, do you have a favorite shell?
I stick with Bash. I'm old.
Same.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems now it's like I'm so comfortable in Bash. Adopting a new shell just seems like so much overhead that it's not
Oh, tell me about it.
it's
It's
not
just too
worth
much
it.
trouble.
Yeah, too
Yeah.
much trouble. And Bash seems to be everywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. Uh, and you've got a lot of background here on the statistical analysis. So are there like specific types of analysis that you would do in your observability work?
Very much so. And that's always the challenging part of you. I typically start simple, start with your basics of your averaging and think of it, your groupings, and how do you lay this out over time? How do you do your math over time? Yeah, and then do things and then get it into your machine learning driven components. And that's where like the Python data science toolkit is so powerful. And because this is just something that just have to understand the impact of the statistical analysis on the data, and you have to match it with the data. Trying to take one, irregular data and then trying to average it over time, you get really weird results. And so that context is so important. And so a lot of times it's an exploration capability. And I think that's where observability comes in, because you have to have the ability to ask questions and do research, do analysis, and then try to apply your results. And those are it takes time. It's not doesn't work the first time, it's not the second time, but you got to keep working on it, constantly.
Yeah,
And
you're
it's
always iterating.
especially with the machine learning, there's different models that have different impact on your data. That's probably the hardest part, like my team had was, and this is where we'd reach out to the data science team to say, this is our data, this is how we've described it, this is how we've cleaned it up, and does it match with this model? It does it, because we want to make sure that we're not introducing bias, that we're not missing things. And those are always, and it's just, this is very different for the typical operations teams. This is just
Yeah.
outside the skill set of most of your admins. And so this is why it's important that you start expanding your skill set to be able to handle these new roles.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then we get into kind of like our specific tooling, right? Like, these are just four things, depending on what environment you work in, there could be 40 ththings here.
Yes.
But I think in general, knowing APM, right? You don't have to know all the tools, but knowing the broad strokes of how it works
Right.
and most importantly, what its limitations are, right?
Right.
No APM tool is perfect. They're often cost prohibitive to deploy widely in organizations, but you still have to know the broad strokes of how they work. We talked about log analysis already, but sorry, let me take a step back. On APM, we're talking about things like New Relic, right? And there's a number of other APM tools out there as well. But knowing why people use them, how they use them, what kind of data you can expect out of them is important. And then, Ed, your background in log analysis, tools like Splunk, tools like Elastic, there's a handful of them that are really popular, and then there's a lot of kind of second tier vendors that look a lot like Elastic, frankly.
Right. Hmm.
And then we talked about time series databases, and then BI and visualization, right?
Yep.
Looker, Tableau, etc.
Yeah, it's really important to have a broad understanding, because when you're doing this analysis, it's all about your context. And if you're looking for something that your data doesn't provide, then you're never, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And you don't need to be an expert at it, but you need a broad understanding for sure.
And all these tools kind of work the same. Like all the BI tools, like you start creating like effectively your dimensions on the data that you want to explore, and then you create various ways to decorate it, whether it's a chart, it's a graph, it's a map.
Mhm.
But they all kind of work the same, whether it's Tableau, whether it's Power BI. So once you know one, you kind of know the major concepts for the others too. So you
Right.
you you won't be like incredibly fluent, but you should be functional, maybe with a few Google searches.
And
Um,
one last thing that you need to be able to work with others because you're going to be working with people in business units to get value from this data. So it's important to be able to take what you know and apply it to various use cases to help your users
You're
do their
talking
business.
past our content, Ed.
I know. Yeah. All right, so let's go to the next. You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's jump ahead.
All right. So, and this is where I mean, I harp on this constantly, but it is important. You have to mash your analytics with context. Data without context just simply doesn't mean anything. And I've seen this repeatedly in the technical and non-technical world, a statistician trying to make assumptions about data without having any background in the data. And I can't say it enough. And this is why you don't have to know how an application works, but it's important to work with the people who do. Is this an online application? Is this a batch application? Does the business like, for example, does the user have the ability to change their own business logic? Because those are things that'll throw off your results. Imagine you have an application that's configurable per user with their business logic, and you're using an ML to understand the baseline of what's normal. Well, the customer changes their business logic, and guess what? Their baseline changes. You could easily, if you're not careful, trigger a Sev1 bridge because your machine learning says something's changed, something's bad. We need to do something about it. And you have to understand the underlying changes and have that context in order to be effective.
One of the easiest ways to share context is to structure your data and add a lot of rich metadata to it. This is where there's a lot of interest in like data products now, and this is an offshoot of the data mesh conversation we were having earlier. Right. And so the idea is that in the API or in the product that I offer you, there will be enough context there that you'll be able to understand it. Right. And if you don't think this is a big deal, go ask your CFO how many customers your company has. Right. You're going to get 4 or 5 different answers because there's a lot of it depends in there. Yes. And so structuring your data, it makes things faster, right? It lets you index things more readily. It lets you do any kind of additional processing on it, but it also adds a lot of context to it. And this is the topic, I think, of our next slide here around what's becoming popularly known as data literacy, right? And this is a big kind of scary image, but basically it's do you speak data, right? Are we on the same page when we talk about an event, when we talk about an incident that occurred? And in the security space, security has so much lingo and jargon that people just shut down, right? Like Ed mentioned earlier at the very top of the broadcast, he started talking about CVEs. Most people in your organization are not going to know what the hell a CVE is. So you've got to think about, how do I frame this in a way that makes sense for them? Don't expect everybody in your company to get on your level. If you want to be, the soft skills and communication skills are going to be essential in your career. If you want to be known as someone who is an effective communicator, you have to communicate, you have to meet your audience where they're at. Yes. They're not going to be security pros. They're not going to be statistics. They're not going to be stats experts. They're not going to be data scientists. They're people trying to do their job just like you are. And so you've got to think about, all right, how do I translate this stuff to my audience? It's on you to reach them, not the other way around.
And this is arguably, I would say, the hardest skill set for engineers, security operations, whatnot, architects to do, because I could take a class on Python, take a class on communicating with executives. That I find more often than not, that's an art you have to learn over time. You need mentorship, and it's typically, it just doesn't match up with most technical people. And it is not easy, but it's critical because you have to be able to say, hey, if I say I have this tool and it's amazing value and it's doing all this for my company, but if you can't communicate that up to your leaders, they're just, they're not going to hear your message. Right. And it is critical. The communication skills of soft skills are so important.
Yeah. And that's, you will develop those over time if you work at it. Don't just expect to fall into it, but it's got to be intentional type of growth that you're looking for. And so if you're interested more in data literacy, a former colleague of mine, Valerie Logan, she has a huge training program around this. She works with a lot of executives as well as engineers on facilitating data literacy. And there's a lot of use cases out there that you can find if you're interested in this type of topic. But all the technical stuff, all of the soft skills, all the communication skills, that's what's going to make an observability engineer, I think, in 2022.
And that's a great, and also we're talking about executives, and I think we've talked about this before, is that so often you're presenting data, but you're going to have the bias of your audience is also going to be impacting your results. And so we ask executives, for example, to make data-backed decisions, but they also carry their own set of biases with them. So it's important. You have to be able to work with people, as you said, where they are.
Yeah. And they're going to have their own incentives, right? Like the data might say one thing, but you know what? My bonus is based on going the opposite direction.
Yes.
So I'm going to go the opposite. So you got to figure out, like, all right, what's motivating these folks? And they, in a lot of executives that I've spoken with are like, they pay lip service to, we want to be data driven, we want to be data led, whatever the term du jour is. But their own biases creep in a lot, and their own experiences, right? Like they think that their executives or their management and they know best. And the reason that they know best is because otherwise they wouldn't be in the position that they're in. Sure. So you often have to kind of build your case over time, right? It may not be like a one-shot deal. You might have to kind of, develop consensus behind the scenes over the course of weeks or months before you kind of get the result that you're looking for.
You got to bang your head against that wall until the wall comes down.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not that rough. But it can feel like it sometimes.
It certainly can. All right, let's go one more slide.
All right.
So talking about the observability skill sets, I'm just going to give some anecdotes. And so bias is a big thing. I've had more than one conversation with executives when they're talking about various ideas, and you're trying to communicate that we're for example, we're looking to introduce anomaly detection. So we need to be able to find, this comes back to observability. You need to be able to find what you don't know. And it's super important to remove bias. I had one executive suggest that we should use guided machine learning based upon our incident tickets that we'd had for the applications. Then I had to raise my hand because you started going to all this data science talk. And I was like, but what if the incident tickets aren't complete? What if the incident tickets are not recording incidents that we don't know about? And that's the whole point, is to find what you don't know. And so you have to always be careful about your bias, about what you're introducing to it. I've had we go through very, very complex data and say, oh, well, but we don't care about that. Why don't you care about that? Your system's fundamentally changing. Don't you want to know why? And so you always have to. It's a negotiation process. But bias is a dangerous thing when it comes to data, especially in observability, because the fundamental of observability is finding those unknown unknowns. And I mean, it's a mouthful of marbles, but it's the truth. You want to find out what you don't know.
Yep.
Number two, application behavior. You got to understand what your application is, what it does, how it works. I mean, is it an online, so it's continuous, it's running all the time? Is it batch? I mean, I've seen people make mistakes where they're applying a baselining behavior to batch. Well, there's really no baseline to batch. It's going to be scheduled. It's going to be on demand. I have 40 batch runs a day. I have 100 tomorrow, and it's going to change. Time of day, holidays is another one. Especially when you're trying to baseline, you need to have a list of, okay, we're going to have bank holidays. You're going to have days that are going to impact your baseline, because all of a sudden you hit your bank holiday and your baseline's off. Your transaction volume falls by 90%. You have a 7-1 bridge that has your CIO on it. And so those are and that could possibly sound like a lesson I've learned the hard way. And so those are the kind of things that you have to look for, and because these external events throw off your data. And so you have to add that context.
Yeah.
Your ML training data set is enormous. The bigger the training set, the more accurate the result, but what's going to be the impact on your performance? For example, we were able to I'm so fortunate to have such a skilled team that we could use a 6-month training set to measure, what does right now look like over the past 6 months. It's just because that's going to give you a much better possibility of having the right answer. But if your systems can't support that, if your data can't support that, you're going to have to understand and accept that accuracy is going to get thrown off. And then lastly, business logic. You have to understand how your applications work, and especially the nature of the business logic and what you're measuring, because that's another thing. It's just it changes fundamental behavior. And so you have to have mechanisms to compensate. And this is where the algorithm that you're using for your machine learning is so important, because some algorithms can compensate for these logic changes better than others. And that's why you got to keep asking it. And finally, I didn't really put this on here, but you've got to treat this like a development process of constant and continuous testing and improvement, because you're in the operational area, your data is never static. There's no stasis. Everything's always changing. And you've got to, when you do your planning, you've got to account for support, you've got to account for change, and understand that it's not a one shot and done.
Yeah, you're never done, right? You're always things are always changing, things are always iterating. You're constantly growing and evolving. No, this is good. This is good. So if you've got questions out there, feel free to reach out to me or Ed
Yeah.
on Twitter. I think we're all set. I think we're all done, right?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, so I just had a quick the idea of talking about an observability pipeline in the data lake. Data lakes where you want to ask your questions, do your analysis, so that you can then feed back your results into your pipeline to get those results. And so it's powerful concepts. I love the change that I'm seeing in the monitoring community. I'm seeing so many more people talking about observability now than ever before. I'm pleased to start seeing security engineers talk about the idea of observability, and it's just it's there's definitely a future there.
Yeah, it's early, but we're definitely starting to see some momentum behind this concept. Perfect. All right, everybody.
Very good. It's just a quick pitch out for Cribl. If you want to take a look at Logstream, just put the link in the down below. Try out sandboxes. You can try out Cribl Logstream functionality. Go hands-on in minutes, get a sense of how the tool works, what you can do with it, and get with almost zero commitment, maybe 30 minutes of your time, but you'll get a sense of how well it works and how it can start setting you down on the road to observability.
Yeah, it's a pretty great experience in the sandbox, so definitely check it out. And go through, you can get your certification in Logstream as well if you complete all the courses. So perfect. All right, Ed, thanks for your time, man. Good.
I appreciate it.
Good live stream.
Yep, great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.